I've been a righteous man my whole life. I've abided by the laws of Torah, donated what I could of my time, talent, and treasure to the local synagogue, and made pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the high holy days. I've taken up the 10 challenges of Adonai and lived my life as an honest man. Fornication, gluttony, and drunkenness were never on my list of appropriate behaviors for a man of God. I work hard for a construction company in Nazareth. I take care of my widowed father, Jacob, and mind my own business. I do my best to do no harm, and as far as I know, I have the respect of my neighbors and the blessing of my rabbi. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed be the Lord God, King of the universe. God and I have gotten along just fine for most of my years. We talk daily and reason things out. But I'll tell you, we went through a rough patch last year, and I have yet to regain my old equilibrium. As I mentioned, my mother died a few years ago in a short but final illness, and my father, Jacob, has been attending a widower's support group at the synagogue. One evening, he brings home with him a friend from this support group by the name of Aaron. Aaron lost his wife in childbirth 14 years ago and has raised his daughter, Mary, pretty much on his own. Of course, the village does much of the raising anyway. His oldest sister's child, Elizabeth, had visited several times at length, providing a woman's guidance along the way. But he'd had his hands full trying to be both mother and father to his only child. These things I knew from the talk of neighbors and the occasional slip of the tongue by my father, bless his soul. So much for the confidentiality of group therapy. As I was saying, Pop brings home this friend of his, Aaron, and Aaron says to me, "So Joseph, I hear you've never been married." I blushed, knowing full well that these widowers have been sharing a lot more family news than spousal grief behind synagogue doors. So much for the privacy of family. I nodded and kept on adding ingredients to the soup that would now have to feed 3 instead of 2. After a while, this Aaron says to me, "So Joseph, the rabbi tells me that you are a good Jew and a righteous man." Under my breath, I'm having a conversation with my invisible rabbi, bless his learned soul, about handing out references without my permission. So much for clergy parishioner confidentiality. Out loud, I say, "I suppose so. I try anyway." I served up my specialty bachelor-style soup and a loaf of bread that I bought from a neighbor that morning. And I sit down at the table with these men of experience and family responsibility. Halfway through the meal, old Aaron says, "So Joseph, my daughter, name of Mary, she's just come into her womanhood." I am aghast, wondering why on earth a man would tell a relative stranger about his daughter's entrance into puberty. But before I can say a word, he says, "So I'm thinking, here's Jacob's son, a good man with a good job and a fine reputation. I'm thinking Mary might make a good wife to such a good man." If I hadn't been so stunned, I would have burst out laughing. Here's my father and his friend acting like Bubby the matchmaker, 2 old yentas and widowers' weeds planning their children's futures, putting their family business in order so they can live out their days in peace, with maybe a few grandchildren to bring them joy and aggravation. I must say, I found the whole situation hilarious, but I also sensed they were serious and anxiously waiting for me to say something. So I put down my bread and swallow the soup in my mouth, and I say, "Let me think about it." My father and Aaron let out the air they'd been holding in their lungs, and Pop says, "Of course." And to Aaron, "He's a thoughtful man, always takes his time with important decisions. Could account for him still being a bachelor." They laughed. I finished my soup, cleaned up, and went to bed. A few days later, I walked by the town well on my way to the work site and had a good look at Mary. I knew who she was. I just hadn't taken a good look before. She seemed handsome enough, laughed a lot with the other women. She caught my eye and dropped hers in the traditional way of girls under scrutiny. But then, was it my imagination? She glanced back up for a split second and winked like a construction worker. I grinned, walked on, shaking my head. I figured, why not? How else am I going to find a wife? I work all day, care for my father in the evenings, maintain the proper distance from women at synagogue. I'm not the type to stroll the town square checking out women like a herd of goats and bargaining for them. So why not marry? I took Aaron up on his offer and had about a week of anticipatory and embarrassing happiness, during which time the entire neighborhood found out and hit me with mazel tov at every turn. Then Mary, being an honest girl, not to mention a tad naive, underneath her self-assured mannerisms, Mary arranged to speak to me at her father's home one afternoon. Aaron was sitting in a corner by the front door, whittling a stir stick with an air of discomfort and what seemed to be disappointment. Mary told me that she found herself to be pregnant, had no clue how it happened. She mentioned something about a visit from an angel of God, and then offered me my freedom under these new circumstances. If I hadn't been so shocked, I would have burst out laughing. This young girl, obviously clueless and ill-used, bravely offering her fiancé the freedom he was likely to take anyway, as if it were hers to give. She was delightful, if not a bit odd, not to mention knocked up. I told her I'd think about it and ambled on home to do just that. I made dinner, chatted with Pop, cleaned up for the night, all the while planning to nullify the engagement and somehow notify the neighbors of the nullified nuptials without shaming Mary. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I had a rare personal visit from my old friend Yod-He Vav-He, and I knew I was about to be told something I didn't want to hear. When God is delivering difficult news, he usually likes to look me in the eye. Adonai said to me, "So Joseph, descendant of David, Joseph, dear Joseph, Mary is a good girl and she's telling you the truth. The kid is mine and I need you to make an honest woman out of this girl. Marry her, Joseph, and name the kid Yeshua, because he is born to save his people. Just like Moses. You do remember Moses, don't you? Do this for me, Joseph. It's for a good cause. Then you and Mary can have all the kids you want after that. Sons, daughters, you name it, they're yours. What do you say, Joseph? Can you humor me? Will you do this for me?" For some reason, maybe because I was half asleep, I wasn't surprised at all. God has this habit of turning life upside down on a whim. I've seen it happen to all kinds of people, even good people. So with no surprise to stop me, I burst out laughing. Pop called from his bed to ask if I was okay, and I said, "Fine, Dad, just fine." God continued to wait for my response, tapping his foot and looking at the movement of the stars in the sky. Realizing I needed to say something, I told him I'd think about it. God let out a huge breath that he'd been holding and said, "I figured, so Joseph, don't let me down." And he departed in a flurry of light and wings and other rather gratuitous flamboyance that a guy like me doesn't need in order to be impressed by a personal visit from the divine. By the next morning, I was resolved and dropped by Mary's dad's house on the way to work to let Mary know that I wouldn't need my freedom. All I needed was her. I'd made a choice and it was my plan to adopt Yeshua. Mary said, "Who?" And I said, "Yeshua, the baby." And I planned to teach him the craft of rough carpentry and take him to synagogue regularly and let God take care of the rest. Mary was greatly relieved, and as I found out later, had been pondering many things in her heart as well. She told me she'd decided to go visit her cousin Elizabeth in the hill country for a few months. Turns out Elizabeth had been barren for her entire married life. Information I felt was in the category of overshare, but I didn't interrupt Mary's narrative. But she, cousin Elizabeth, had sent news of a miraculous pregnancy accompanied by the striking dumb of her husband, a priest, a bit of a professional handicap. So they were going to commiserate, be pregnant together, enjoy the silence of Elizabeth's muted spouse, and share the unorthodox double miracle until Mary had to come home for her last trimester. I sent her off with my blessing and told her I'd have the house fixed up for her return. And you've heard the rest of the story, I'm sure. Nothing is secret in my neighborhood, let alone all of Nazareth. A Roman census was called for. Shortly after Mary came home, we had to go to Bethlehem, where I'd been born, in order to be counted. God's kid was born, some strange things happened, attributable only to my pal Adonai at work again, turning all of our lives upside down. Just like when Moses was born, the ruler decided to kill off all the baby boys to undermine the growing power block of the laboring population. And just as the Pharaoh's daughter adopted Moses into the house of Egypt and saved him from that massacre, so he might save our people from slavery and genocide, I adopted Yeshua and whisked him off to the land of Egypt, saving him from the massacre of Herod so he might save our fellow citizens from Roman occupation or whatever it was he was supposed to save us from. It has been a strange and ominous and troublesome year, as you can imagine. Nothing has gone the way I thought it would. Such strange reversals have come about, no doubt because Mary and I are the type to say yes to God, in spite of the obvious hazards of doing so. At every turn, there's been a surprise, a choice to be made, an unlikely scenario to prepare for. Men have arranged marriages. Women have offered liberation. God has become human. And I, Joseph ben Jacob, rough carpenter and model citizen of Nazareth, righteous Jew and bachelor, I have married the boyish Mary and become Pharaoh's daughter, living in Egypt, raising my adopted son for an unknown but important destiny. Even if I'd had time to think about it, I never could have imagined this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam.